Would you like a fun fact to upset your friends and family? How about a couple? Consulting my notes here, between 2010 and 2023, median rent in Nevada has increased 70%, but median wages up only 58%. That's what we call in the business not great. I've got a bunch more of these. For instance, nearly 1 in 4 mortgages in Nevada are spending more than 35% of their income on housing. That's what you call on TikTok house poor. And it's a number that's on par with, no joke, New York and New Jersey. Well, that all sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? But to figure out how bad it actually is, I decided I needed firsthand experience. I bought a house. It's more like a condo townhouse situation, but it doesn't matter. For the purposes of this video, I understand so much now. I understand so much. From Battleborn Progress, this is Battleborn Bites. My name is Jacob. Let's invest in real estate. So here's a question. Why is buying a house the way that it is? You know, the 30-year mortgage, 20% down, less if you get a Federal Housing Administration loan. You know, why are all those things like that anyways? So in the 1800s, most of the money for mortgages comes from institutions called savings and loans, or buildings and loans, or thrifts is the sort of shorthand for it. If you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, it's the bank from It's a Wonderful Life.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George.
They are what they sound like. They have savings accounts and they underwrite mortgages. That is basically all they do. By law, they were not allowed to do much else. That works okay as long as the savings and loan doesn't fail while you're paying your mortgage. So in the late 20s and the early 30s, obviously the Great Depression happens. Skyrocketing unemployment, massive bank failures, the likes of which we have never seen and haven't seen since, and frankly just a bunch of other financial problems means that mortgages are in a bad spot, as it turns out. By 1933, something like a quarter of the nation's mortgage debt was in default. So basically, for the first time ever, the federal government not just becomes a major player in how housing markets work, but like the biggest player in how housing markets work. We get, and I'm going to have to read these, the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Federal National Mortgage Association, which you might know better as Fannie Mae, all in the span of just a couple of years. Taken together, these federal policies stabilized the housing industry, creating insurance where there was none, and helping homeowners keep their homes when they were about to lose them. Crucially, it also expands the role for savings and loans to become the way for Americans to secure what we understand as the standard 30-year mortgage with a fixed rate and 20% down. This works pretty good until the 1970s. If you're familiar with the late 70s and how much the economy sucked then, you may have heard of a word called stagflation. The idea here is that normally when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. When inflation goes down, unemployment goes up. Stagflation is when unemployment goes up and inflation goes up. And everyone panics because that's horrific. I mean, listen to that. That's horrific. In order to tackle stagflation, the Fed in the 70s got extremely aggressive with interest rates, meaning lending was extraordinarily expensive, and savings accounts started paying out a lot of money. If you're a savings and loan and had to start paying out a lot of money on savings account and were not getting money back from your mortgages, this is what we call an uh-oh situation. What happened next was the Reagan administration and the rapid deregulation of America's banking sector, starting with savings and loans. Between the 1980s and the early 2000s and the pop of the housing bubble, there were a series of cascading crises and failures by the federal government to address those crises that compounded on one another, allowing corporate criminals, essentially, to loot the inside of the American middle class, letting people default on mortgages and lose their homes while they made away with federal bailouts. You can trace an extraordinary amount of bad stuff back to Reagan. I'm just going to throw that out there. Case in point, that deregulation in the 1980s created a bubble that led to a total crash in the late 80s and early 90s. In that period, more than half of all savings and loan banks in the United States collapsed. It was the largest single collapse of financial institutions since the Great Depression. So here's the thing. A lot of loans at these institutions were for commercial real estate. When that bubble pops, those loans are federally insured. So your regular American taxpayer gets to foot the bill for all of these bailouts, which is cool, good. One would hope, for instance, that the federal government would not be so eager to bail out big banks that were quote-unquote too big to fail instead of helping people stay in their homes. And yet, If you lived in Nevada between 2007 and 2012, I don't have to tell you how bad it got here. Home prices in Las Vegas in particular started higher and ended lower than anywhere else in the country, meaning homes on average lost more than half their value in the worst years of the Great Recession. But soaring foreclosures were bad for renters in Las Vegas too, because suddenly you have a class of people who were homeowners who are now renters. The thing is, today, it feels like we're a lifetime away from the recovery from the Great Recession. The zero interest rate days of the mid-2010s are a distant fever dream, and I will not use this opportunity to remark upon stomp clap indie music, but I'm thinking about it. Nevada homeowners and renters are still in a verified crisis. Let's go back to all those facts from the intro. Those come from a report by the Gwynn Center here in Nevada. They found that nearly half of Nevada renters are spending excessively on rent, meaning they can't save for a down payment for a new home, or they can't save period, or they're struggling to afford other necessities. More than that, they found that extremely low-income households have fewer options here in Nevada than almost any other state, and, of course, that the price of housing is still outpacing wage gains. I'll just quote the report directly. Since 2018, every Nevada county with a double-digit income growth has seen home prices rise at least 2.5 times faster. So, what gives? Picture this. You're in an economics class. The professor points at a graph. Supply go up, price go down. Price go up, supply go down. Please give me my degree. But slow down there, buckaroo, because this July in the year of our Lord 2025, Las Vegas was actually leading the nation for the number of new listings on the market. And as the graphs foretold, the prices went up. So how does that happen? It turns out there's no one reason for anything, is there? Why do bad things happen to good people? Zoning laws, probably. Actually, we're going to start with everyone's favorite part, and that's public lands. Yay! This is really part of the supply question. I don't know if you've looked around recently, but most of Nevada, big desert. Big desert out there. The thing about that big desert is that 80% of it is owned by the federal government, the Bureau of Land Management. It is not a simple process, necessarily, for cities to acquire that land and, say, sell it to a developer for housing or whatever. But that disposal, and the word disposal is the term of art here, is key when we're talking about how Nevada and how Las Vegas in particular became one of the fastest growing cities in the country over the last 30 years. Take yourself back to the 1970s. You're a developer and you see all this land in Las Vegas. It's nice and flat. I would like that land, please, you say, federal government. Can I have it? And their answer might be, maybe. Every single land deal was a one-off. You just had to negotiate with the federal government and hope they gave it to you. That made things extremely complicated and a little opaque, frankly. With burgeoning development also came burgeoning environmental concerns, especially as the rise of environmentalism in the 1970s and the 1980s ran up against this expansion. So that's why in 1980 we get the Santini-Burton Act, which creates the first disposal boundaries in Nevada, where the BLM can more easily sell land for development in exchange for conservation. Well, that thing lasts about a decade before everyone decides that the boundary is in fact too small. Everyone also decides that there should actually be more of an emphasis on conservation as well. There were opportunities left on the table for everyone. Problem: creating a bigger boundary also means you have to be more careful with the natural areas that surround both cities. Tahoe is the obvious one in northern Nevada, but even in Las Vegas, areas like Red Rock, Lake Mead, Sloan Canyon, and Mount Charleston were gems of southern Nevada, and everyone wanted to keep them looking pretty. And you know what? Good. I love Red Rock. I'd love doing a little hike. So condensing the political fight over this, in 1998, we get SNPLMA, the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act, and I will keep referring to it as SNPLMA. The long and short of it is that Nevada would be able to sell tens of thousands of acres in the new, larger disposal boundary in exchange for bigger areas marked for conservations in other areas of the state. More importantly, the money from these land sales would go into a specific Nevada fund. That fund could help reinvest into developing actual utilities in that land or for conservation or for all kinds of things. The important thing is that the money didn't go back to the federal treasury, as often did with those earlier land sales. Ultimately, combined with another Clark County lands bill in 2002, Southern Nevada gets about 68,000 acres as part of SNPLMA and, the other land bills to sell from the federal government. That land spurs, it just must be said, a tremendous boom of construction because it happens to coincide directly with the housing bubble. So in 2007, 2008, when the music stops and the Great Recessioning, Vegas is in a bit of a pickle. Because of the way the city had expanded during that peak housing boom, there was just sort of a lot of sprawl everywhere. Moreover, a lot of these homes, like I mentioned earlier, were extremely volatile in price, having been extremely inflated in 2006 and now losing a tremendous amount of their value by 2009, 2010. But housing prices actually wouldn't reach their nadir, or the bottom, until 2012. But here's the thing. Since then, Las Vegas has had one of the hottest housing markets in the country, basically this entire time. But those soaring prices haven't been met with the same construction boom that we saw pre-recession, which meant that those prices have created a housing squeeze in a way that we didn't see pre-Great Recession. So, okay, let's return to that original question. How the heck is housing inventory going up and pricing going up? Well, here are 3.5 reasons. Costs, zoning, financing, and a mysterious fourth thing that we're going to get to later. But let's start with costs. So as a baseline, a tremendous amount of people have moved to Las Vegas in the last 2 decades. We're talking about 750,000 people in the late 90s and something like 2.5 million today, give or take, I'm ballparking here. But building has remained dramatically lower than pre-recession levels. So here's an example. Between 1993 and 2006, you can basically count on one hand the number of times there were fewer than 2,000 building permits issued in a single month in Las Vegas. After the recession, it has happened literally once, in January 2022. Good on you, January 2022. Why are there fewer permits being issued? Well, that can be a lot of things, but one of the big reasons is it's simply expensive for developers to apply for permits. But one of the reasons developers don't apply in the first place is because building stuff can just be expensive. One reason right now is tariffs. Canadian lumber might make it easier to build a house until you tariff the heck out of the lumber, and then what are you going to do with the wood? But there's also a labor question. Nevada actually has a pronounced construction labor shortage, and so fewer construction workers means each individual construction project becomes that much more expensive. So what you end up with is this kind of U-shape for the kind of projects that end up getting built. Governments, recognizing the need to provide affordable housing to the people who need it most, end up subsidizing projects and making sure that developers prioritize those projects too. So cool. We get those kinds of affordable projects. That's good. On the other end, developers love building a giant suburban McMansion hellscape because they're going to make a giant fat load of cash on that. So the rich people homes get built too. What's missing? The humble starter home, now disappearing faster than a humble Las Vegas buffet. But then there's also the issue of zoning and permitting. I know this sounds super sexy, but zoning and permitting is actually one of the biggest issues when it comes to affordable housing. So in Vegas, for instance, there are much stricter restrictions on building multifamily housing than there are in Reno. What we end up with are these 2 maps where you can see here is the multifamily in Vegas, here is multifamily in Reno. Now please guess which one is building more multifamily housing. Weird how that works. There are also a bunch of other more granular zoning issues. One of them is something called minimum lot size, for instance. So in suburban areas especially, laws will require that each lot has to be X acres big. And so the bigger a minimum lot means the bigger the house that goes on it, which usually means the more expensive the house is, which makes the affordability crisis worse. Well, good news, Nevada has actually the smallest minimum lot size in the entire country by law, and Vegas has the second smallest of any metro. Cool. But there are other things too, like minimum parking lot sizes. This all is part of the big stew of why everything is so expensive. And of course, there is also the land question. One of the things you'll hear most often is that Vegas cannot lower its housing prices without selling more land. To some extent, sure, why not, buddy? You sell the land, people build on the land. Awesome. Here's the problem, though, is that selling more land is not an instant solution or a pile of magic beans. Once you sell the land, you have to figure out if you can even build on it. Can you even hook up utilities? Are you going to get schools, fire, police? You going to get internet out there, buddy? You got fiber? You got a fiber hookup out there? Politically, this is a bipartisan thing that lots of people have been trying to get more land. But the issue is not only have these bills not really gone anywhere, but whatever political capital that Nevada had in the 1990s and early 2000s, a guy named Harry Reid, no longer there. And so the deal that Nevada got to keep the money from these BLM land land sales is probably no longer politically feasible. I'm not just saying that. Look at what happened this summer. Utah Senator Mike Lee drew up these vast plans to sell off, these huge chunks of the American West, including giant chunks of Nevada, and all of that money would have gone to the federal treasury, not Nevada. To quote the Gwynn Center report again, land is part of the story. It is not the story. And then, of course, there's also the financing part of this. If you casually absorb the news, maybe you've seen this guy. This is Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve sets an interest rate, a kind of super interest rate that doesn't set other rates but does influence them greatly. This is the federal funds rate. Coincidentally, it is also why Donald Trump wants to fire Jerome Powell, but that is a subject that is beyond the scope of this video. It's crazy though. It's crazy that he wants to do that, but it's beyond the scope of this video. In any case, the point of the federal funds rate is a lever the Fed can pull when inflation they think is out of control. So for instance, in 2022, inflation starts going up. The Fed increases the federal funds rate so that lending is more expensive. If lending is more expensive, theoretically, people spend less, and when people spend less, inflation cools down. In theory. So the thing is, inflation has been kind of all over the place, especially with tariffs. The problem is the relationship high rates have today to the housing boom of the last 10 years. So right after the Great Recession, the federal funds rate was basically zero, and it was basically zero for a long time, which meant that you could secure a mortgage for basically nothing, and your monthly payment was awesome. Then COVID happens, and it's still zero again. But then in 2022, rates go up. Way up in order to stop runaway inflation. Good news, it actually worked. Rare W from the Fed here on that one. Bad news, with an effective federal funds rate of 4.3% as of recording this video, that means mortgage rates are somewhere north of 6.5% to 7%. If you're trying to buy a house, congratulations. No one's really selling that much because no one wants to sell when interest rates suck. Ask me how I know this. But we can't even talk about who's building the houses or who's selling the houses without talking about the mysterious fourth or third and a half thing. The who or the what is buying the houses. So a couple of weeks ago, I was a guest on a radio show. These kinds of things happen to me because listen to my voice. We were talking about the legislative session and the relative veto-based disaster that it was, and the conversation went to housing policy. And one of the other guests said something that has been rattling around in my brain ever since.
I was having this conversation with my son, was wondering if he would ever buy a home. And I said, I think the market's shifting to renting, and people will figure that out. Maybe the future is not home ownership. That's always been the American dream. Maybe that's not the reality anymore. There's limited things the government can do and socially engineer our way out of this.
And see, that one was funny because I had literally just bought this condo, which, look, I still stresses me out. I'm stressed out. But it was also sort of just short-circuiting me, The whole point of, getting wealth in America, the American dream, is to, you buy a starter house and then you eventually sell the starter house to buy a bigger house. You get the nuclear family, you get the dog, the 2.5 kids, the picket fence, the whole deal. If I'm not going to do that, then who is? Or what is? Enter private equity. Look, private equity is not necessarily a new concept, but it is more aggressive now than it has been in a long time. You may remember the slow gutting of Toys R Us. Conceptually, private equity is just a firm, a banking firm or whatever, really interested in a company, and they think they can maximize profits for that company, turn it around, and then sell it for a profit. The problem lies with how they usually try and do that. Like fire a bunch of people, make the service worse, charge people more for the thing, and then unload whatever you have left at the end. Generally speaking, this is not fun for the consumer. Think about Southwest Airlines, for instance. You ever fly Southwest? Well, now Southwest is majority owned by a private equity company. Guess when Southwest got rid of their free checked bag? And you know what? That's only the beginning, folks. That's only the beginning. There's this concept you're probably familiar with called enshittification. In 2022, it was coined by the journalist Cory Doctorow, and I'm just going to quote him directly about social media platforms. Here is how platforms die. First, they are good to their users. Then they abuse their users to make things better for their business customers. Finally, they abuse those business customers to claw back all the value for themselves. Then they die. So since 2022, I think we may have noticed perhaps the enshittification of everything. Everything is more expensive. Everything just a little bit worse than it used to be. Some of this is nostalgia. A lot of it is not. This is the corporate squeezing of every little good thing we used to have. I mean, even just think about parking on the Las Vegas Strip. I remember when you could just park there for free. Those were the days. Private equity, then, is the final evolution of enshittification. It is the logical apparatus of a system that is not concerned with, say, the consumer, but only concerned with the investor, with the corporate billionaire, you know? Why stick up for the little guy? The little guy is where we get all our money from. Well, why do I mention any of this? Well, it turns out in 2024 and 2025, private equity really loves housing, and in particular, really loves housing in Las Vegas. In 2024, there was one single day where a single private equity firm bought 264 properties in Vegas. In the third quarter of last year, 23% of all home transactions were investors, accounting for over $1 billion in total volume. These homes are rental homes. The whole point is that no one else is gonna buy them. Remember earlier when I said that 50% of all Nevada renters are cost burdened? Well, yeah. Being a cost-burden renter means that you never afford the down payment on a house, so you can avoid being a cost-burden renter. Just for instance, my mortgage is like 50% less than if I tried to rent in the area that I'm living in. Look at that. Math. See, because there's so many knock-on effects of what happens when private equity buys a house to rent and make sure that no one else can buy that as a starter home. And if you can't buy those smaller starter properties, then you never get the equity to invest in something bigger, in the forever home. The thing is this is the natural conclusion of this economy where you own nothing and they expect you to be happy. Your wealth is ultimately never your own. And look, I don't want to overstate the causal relationship between private equity and housing prices. Housing prices are mostly influenced by all the stuff we talked about earlier. Costs, labor, zoning, land, the list goes on, right? But to say we should take nothing from the entrance of private equity into the housing market, I think misses the forest for the trees. We don't know that every home a private equity firm buys was going to be a home bought by a Joe Schmo family with a dog. It could have been someone trying to run an illegal Airbnb. It happens. It could happen to you. But one thing we know for sure is that when private equity is buying a home, they're sure as hell not going to live in it. So it's a good thing Republican Governor Joe Lombardo is on the case because, and let me check my notes here, he instructed legislative Republicans to vote down a proposal that would have limited the number of homes corporate landlords could buy in a year. So, okay. Well, what is Lombardo's plan? Well, to steelman it for a second, his marquee bill this session was AB 450. He calls this, hold on, I gotta read this, the Nevada Housing Access and Attainability Act. So the main thing is that it's shifting the goalposts from affordable housing to attainable housing. So the main thing it does is create a pot of money available for down payment assistance. Attainable housing adds an extra tier where now if you're making 150% of the median income, you have access to that money. What does this mean in real dollars? Well, in Vegas, the median household income is about $70,700. So 150% of that is about $106,000 for a household. Down payment assistance is nice, but ultimately it's just down payment assistance. This is a multifaceted problem and frankly, a structural problem with structural solutions. Importantly, this bill also came when Lombardo vetoed a bunch of other stuff. One big thing being reforming Nevada's eviction system. Nevada is still the only state in the entire country where when you are evicted, the burden is on you, the evicted tenant, to sue your landlord for evicting you. In every other state, it's the landlord who has to sue you, the tenant, to evict you. So in a moment when both the housing and rental markets are trapped in this crisis of affordability, I suppose the solution from Lombardo's office is just to veto our way out. Why do anything when we could do nothing instead? That is the Nevada way. But that does it for this week's episode of Battleborn Bites. If you like the show, like and subscribe to make sure that you're the first to know when we upload a new episode. But until then, from Battleborn Progress, this has been Battleborn Bites. My name is Jacob. We'll see you next week.